Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing first Utterance by the band Comus.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
There is so much that I want to say about this band and about this album, but beforehand we'll do the tradition and we'll begin with my favorite bits from this album.
Silence, the broken Christian creeps. Each footstep like and the Christian drop. He hangs above the sin.
Fucking finally, you know how long I've been waiting for this album to pop on the list. When I did my initial research for this series, I've encountered this album so many times, and it's not like I encountered it on the mainstream websites like on the Rolling Stones top 100 prog albums of all times. No, I've seen it on like the most obscure places, which already told me that this album was a favorite by the hardcore prog fans, and that's exactly what I was looking for. So this album is definitely one that I was anticipating to listen to, and I'm so happy that I got to do so today. And of course, the amazing cover for this album also had a hand in actually making me anticipate this one even more, but we're gonna get to that later in the video. But for starters, who are Comus? Well, Comus or Comus, I don't know how you're supposed to say it because it comes from Greek, but they're a band that formed in Kent back in 1967. Now, for those of you keen viewers, you'd know that Kent is where the Canterbury scene began, but this happened much before the Soft Machine and Caravan, and these guys actually made their own very unique style of prog folk. And if you don't know, this album is considered by many to be one of the best, if not the best, progressive folk album of all times. And seeing as we don't usually get a lot of prog folk albums on the list, and the last time we had a prog folk album it was with Jethro Tull, but it was their first album and it was more blues than actual progressiveness, then I'd say that I'm really happy to get into this really unique subgenre that I personally really like. Now, the name Comus is actually the name of a Greek god who is the god of anarchy and chaos. Now, that is foretelling of something, and that's the subject matter of this album, and I really want to get into talking about that, but we'll get to it just a bit later because I have to tell you a bit more about this band. So, despite being active since 1967, this album actually came out in 1971. Now, the reason for it probably comes down to the fact that the band weren't really able to find a good record company to sign them, and that was mostly because of their music's dark subject matter and of course their very much unique and absurd sound. But finally in 1971 the band actually were able to find a record publisher under the Dawn label, and these guys, despite having the willfulness of helping the band create their first and debut album, were really unprepared to actually help the band in creating their own unique style of music because they were mostly usually recording TV or pop artists. And just to clarify, back in the day the leading artist in the Dawn label was actually Mango Jerry, the one who made the hit song In the Summertime, and if you know that song and you know this album, you know that the two of them could not have been more different from one another, and they both took very different approaches in the way of recording and mixing the music. And seeing as the music by Comus required many unique instruments and vocal performances and a lot of things that were existing simultaneously, the record studio didn't really have a way to accompany them and actually record them, so they went out and actually recorded a lot of things live all together, and that has made this album. And surprisingly, the recording quality for it, despite being recorded in a live setting, does actually sound quite nice. So as I told you, Comus is the Greek god for anarchy and chaos, or in other words, he is the god of sins. And the concept of this album is that each and every song deals to some extent with a different sinful activity. For example, the first track, which is called Diana, actually revolves around the subject of rape. And yes, I can say rape because my channel isn't monetized. Want to help me? You can check out my Patreon. The song Drip Drip is about violence and murder, and the song The Prisoner is about electroconvulsive therapy, which was a way basically of torturing people who were mentally ill and having the government subsidize it all. And maybe above them all lies what is to be considered the title track for this album, called Song for Comus. This song was specifically inspired by John Milton's 1643 poem, in which a girl gets lost in the woods and then is approached by the character of Comus, who manipulates her into doing several sinful activities with him. Now, for the faint of heart, this album might sound really dark and somber to you, and you'd be correct. If you focused on the lyrics themselves, you'd see that the subject matter is really dark and macabre. But the thing about it, it has a lovely contrast by juxtaposing it with the music, which is actually folk music, which is very cheery and upbeat and very fun to listen to. And if I did not listen or know what the lyrics were about, I think that this album is just, you know, your casual waltz around the campfire album to begin with. And you know, I have to give it to Comus. Their use of juxtaposition and the oxymoron effect that they have on here is one, if not the best I've ever seen on an entire album. This album, needless to say, is really dark and deals with some very heavy and mature and very disdainful subjects, and the way that it just uses it with very cheery music makes for such an amazing effect, and I really enjoyed it. Well, if you can enjoy these kinds of things. But if you've noticed, there are actually two songs on the album which I didn't mention quite yet, these ones being The Bite and Bitten. And you know, The Bite is actually my favorite song from this album. Everything that I've just described to you about the way that this album operates is found on this one specifically. It has a very dark subject matter, and the imagery that is conjured by following the lyrics is very much beautiful and very dark in its essence, but at the same time the music is just so fun and it does everything greatly. And then you have the next track called Bitten, which is a short instrumental track that kind of acts as an epilogue to the latter, and it's a pretty nice song, but definitely not one of the high points of this album. And you know, I've listened to this album by this point 3 times, and I've heard it for the first time I think 2 days ago, which means a lot about an album usually. It isn't perfect per se, I think there are some things that didn't quite stick with me, but all in all, it is an album I love to divulge in. And if anyone watching this video doesn't know this album quite yet, I highly advise you to do what I just did and go ahead and give it a listen, because it will really be worth your time. What a beautiful cover this is. I didn't say it at the beginning quite yet, but one of the reasons I was anticipating this album very much is because of its second to none cover. Would you believe me if I told you that this one was actually drawn using a ballpoint pen? Well, it is, and more than that, it was actually drawn by the band leader Roger Wooten, who besides of being a very talented musician also happens to be a very gifted artist. Now, the band unfortunately would go on to quickly disband, and thus making this album their only record for a long time until they actually reformed in the 2000s, and they released an album called Out of the Coma. Now I'm going to show you the cover here on the side. This album basically features the same figure, which I can only assume to be Comus himself, probably rising from the coma he's been in, which kind of implies that the first cover itself shows him sleeping, despite it actually looking like he's disgusted of something. And while I don't have a lot to say about this cover anymore, I just have to say that in terms of memorability and of overall aesthetics and everything that has to do with a good cover, this one gets a rating of 10 out of 10 on all of them. So originally I was actually about to give this album a rating of 8 out of 10, but coming back to it several times I realized that I really like this one, so it's getting the very fine and prestigious rating of 9 out of 10. But that's about it guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Rick Wakeman. I of course want to thank my lovely supporter over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Walnum, you are the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it guys, have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.